Margot Hayes pressed her thumb against the elevator button for the 14th floor, her other hand clutching a worn leather portfolio that contained everything she'd worked toward for the past 3 years. Inside were sketches, photographs, data charts, and a proposal that she'd revised at least 50 times. Her reflection in the polished elevator doors showed a woman who'd gotten maybe 4 hours of sleep, whose dark curly hair was pulled into what she hoped passed for a professional bun, and whose vintage blazer from a thrift store in Capitol Hill was doing its best to say, "serious filmmaker" rather than perpetually broke dreamer. The elevator chimed, and Margot stepped into the hallway of the Regency Tower in downtown San Francisco, her sneakers silent against the plush carpet. She'd driven down from Seattle the night before, crashing on Caroline's couch and practicing her pitch until her best friend had thrown a pillow at her and begged for mercy. This meeting with Pacific Horizon Productions could change everything. They'd expressed interest in her documentary about coral reef restoration, and while their initial offer was modest, it was a foot in the door. It was legitimacy. It was a chance. Room 1407. She spotted it at the end of the hallway and checked her phone. 2 minutes early? Perfect. Margot took a deep breath, rolled her shoulders back, and pushed open the heavy door. The conference room was more impressive than she'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bay, and the morning light streamed across a table made of some dark, expensive wood. Several people in sharp business attire sat around it, and at the head of the table was a man who made Margot forget her opening line entirely. He looked to be in his early 30s, with the kind of casual confidence that came from never having to prove himself. His dark hair was slightly messy in that deliberate way that probably required expensive product, and his gray sweater over a white shirt suggested someone who didn't need a suit to command respect. When he looked up at her entrance, his eyes were an almost startling shade of hazel, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You must be our 10 o'clock, he said, his voice warm with a hint of curiosity. "Please, come in. We're eager to hear what you have to say." Margot blinked. The enthusiasm seemed unusual for what Caroline had described as a standard preliminary meeting. But maybe Pacific Horizon was more excited about the project than they'd let on. She moved toward an empty chair, her portfolio suddenly feeling heavier. "Thank you for seeing me," she began, settling into her seat and pulling out her materials. "I know documentary filmmaking about environmental issues isn't always the most lucrative investment, but I genuinely believe this story needs to be told." Something flickered across the man's face, but he gestured for her to continue. "We're listening." Margot launched into her pitch, and as she spoke, something magical happened. The words that had felt stilted during practice flowed naturally. She talked about the coral reefs she'd visited as a marine biology student, the devastating bleaching events that had turned vibrant ecosystems into underwater graveyards, and the scientists working desperately to develop restoration techniques. She described the footage she'd already captured on her maxed-out credit cards, the interviews she'd lined up, and the narrative arc that would take viewers from despair to hope. "The thing is," she said, leaning forward, "people are tired of doom and gloom. They want to know what they can do. This documentary won't just show the problem. It'll show the solutions, the innovators, the communities coming together. It'll make people believe that their actions matter." She pulled out her tablet and showed them a rough cut of her opening sequence, time-lapse of a restored coral section slowly regaining its color, intercut with close-ups of tiny fish returning to their habitat. The room was silent as it played, and Margot held her breath. When it ended, the man at the head of the table sat back in his chair, and a slow smile spread across his face. "That's remarkable. The passion is evident, and frankly, we could use more of that kind of authentic storytelling." He glanced at his colleagues. "What do you think?" A woman with silver hair and elegant glasses nodded. "It's certainly different from our usual focus, but the market for purpose-driven content is growing. There's potential here." Margot's heart soared. This was going better than she dared to hope. The man extended his hand across the table. "I'm James Sullivan. I think we can work together on this. Let's talk about budget and timeline." As Margot shook his hand, feeling the warm, firm grip, she noticed how his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled. There was something magnetic about him, something that made her stomach flip in a way that was entirely unprofessional and definitely inconvenient. For the next 40 minutes, they discussed logistics. James asked insightful questions about filming locations, interview subjects, and distribution plans. He seemed genuinely invested in understanding her vision, not just the potential return on investment. The other people in the room, including a sharp-looking man who introduced himself as Derek Huang, chimed in occasionally. But James clearly led the conversation. "I'm thinking we could look at a budget in the range of $300,000, James said, jotting notes on a legal pad. "That should cover your filming, a small crew, post-production, and some festival submissions. We'd want quarterly updates and approval on the final cut, but I don't believe in micromanaging creative projects." Margot nearly choked on the water she'd been sipping. $300,000? Pacific Horizon's initial estimate had been closer to $75,000, and she'd been prepared to negotiate up from there. This was beyond anything she'd imagined. "That's incredibly generous," she managed, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'd want to ensure we're aligned on the creative direction, but I'm confident we can deliver something exceptional." "I don't doubt it," James said. "Your passion is infectious." It's exactly the kind of authentic voice that cuts through all the noise. As the meeting wrapped up, James stood and walked her toward the door. "My assistant will send over the contract details by tomorrow. In the meantime, why don't you send me that full proposal? I'd like to review your timeline more carefully." "Absolutely," Margot said, clutching her portfolio. "Thank you so much for this opportunity. You won't regret it. I'm sure I won't." He paused, his hand on the doorframe. "I have to say, when Derek suggested we take this meeting, I wasn't sure what to expect, but this is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need more of." Margot smiled, though something about his phrasing nagged at her. Before she could analyze it, James was shaking her hand again, and then she was in the hallway. The door closing softly behind her. She made it to the elevator before the enormity of what had just happened hit her. $300,000. A real budget. A real chance to make the documentary she'd dreamed about. She pulled out her phone to call Caroline, her hands shaking slightly as she pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator descended. Margot noticed the directory on the wall. Her eyes scanned the 14th floor listings and stopped cold. Suite 1407, Sullivan Ventures. Capital, not Pacific Horizon Productions. Pacific Horizon was on the 12th floor. Suite 1207. The elevator seemed to drop faster, and Margot's stomach dropped with it. She'd gone to the wrong meeting. She'd pitched her documentary to a venture capital firm, not the production company that had agreed to see her. And James Sullivan, the man who'd just offered her $300,000, had thought she was supposed to be there. The elevator doors opened, and Margot stumbled into the lobby, her mind racing. She should go back. She should explain. She should clear up the confusion right now, before it went any further. But $300,000? Her phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. How did it go? Margot stared at the message, then at the elevator bank, then back at her phone. The ethical choice was obvious. The right thing to do was march back up there and explain the misunderstanding. James seemed like a reasonable person. He'd probably laugh it off, maybe even be impressed by her accidental audacity. But what if he wasn't? What if explaining the mistake meant losing not just this funding, but any chance of him taking her seriously in the future? What if she went to the real Pacific Horizon meeting, and they offered their modest budget, and she'd thrown away a miraculous opportunity because of pride? Her phone buzzed again. Margot. Details now. She typed back, "Call you in 5. It's complicated." That was an understatement. Margot walked out of the Regency Tower into the bright San Francisco morning, the bay breeze carrying the scent of salt water and possibility. Somewhere above her in that 14th floor conference room, James Sullivan was probably already having his assistant draft a contract for a project he thought he'd intentionally agreed to fund, and Margot Hayes, documentary filmmaker and apparent accidental con artist, had no idea what to do next. She found a bench near the waterfront and sat down, watching joggers and tourists pass by. Her phone rang, and Caroline's face filled the screen. "Well?" her friend demanded. "Did they go for it?" "They went for it," Margot said slowly. "But Caroline, I have a problem." "What kind of problem?" Did they lowball you? Because you can negotiate. You know that, right? I went to the wrong meeting. There was a long silence. What do you mean the wrong meeting? Margot explained, her words tumbling over each other. The wrong floor. James Sullivan? Sullivan Ventures Capital. The $300,000 budget. The contract that would arrive tomorrow. Caroline whistled low. Okay, this is fixable. You just need to call him and explain. These things happen. He'll understand. Will he? What if he thinks I scammed him? What if he's so embarrassed that he not only pulls the funding but tells everyone in the industry that I'm a fraud? You're not a fraud. It was an honest mistake. It's an honest mistake that I didn't correct for an entire hour while he offered me nearly $500,000, Margot said. Carolyn, I didn't say anything. Not when he mentioned his assistant, not when he talked about Derek suggesting the meeting, not when he literally walked me to the door. I just took the money and ran. He didn't take anything yet. No contracts are signed. Caroline's voice was firm. Look, I know this is scary, but you have to tell him. Before this goes any further, Margot knew her friend was right. She'd built her career on telling difficult truths through her documentaries. She'd interviewed scientists who'd devoted their lives to thankless work, activists who fought against impossible odds, and communities struggling to preserve their way of life. She'd never shied away from hard conversations. But this was different. This was personal. And the truth was, in that conference room, with James Sullivan's hazel eyes fixed on her and his enthusiasm building with every word she spoke, she'd felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, tangible hope that her dreams might actually come true. I'll tell him, she said finally. Just let me figure out how. Soon, Margot. Before you get in any deeper, after they hung up, Margot sat on the bench for another 20 minutes, watching the sailboats in the bay. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was James Sullivan, and the subject line read, "Looking forward to working together." She opened it with trembling fingers. The email was brief and warm, expressing his excitement about the project and mentioning that his legal team would have paperwork ready soon. He'd attached a preliminary production agreement for her to review and noted that he'd cleared his schedule for next Tuesday if she wanted to meet and discuss the project in more detail. At the bottom, he'd added, "I have a good feeling about this. Sometimes the best opportunities are the ones you don't see coming." Margot closed her eyes. He had no idea how right he was. She typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Finally, she settled on something simple and professional. Confirming Tuesday's meeting and thanking him again for the opportunity. Her finger hovered over the send button. This was the moment. She could add a line explaining the confusion. 3 sentences, maybe 4, and the whole mess would be cleared up. But what if clearing it up meant losing everything? Margot pressed send and immediately felt the weight of what she'd just done. She'd had the chance to come clean and chosen not to. She'd let him believe the lie for just a little longer. Just until Tuesday. She'd tell him on Tuesday, face to face, and hope that her passion for the project would be enough to make him see past the misunderstanding. As she walked back toward the parking garage where she'd left her ancient Honda, Margot tried to convince herself that this wasn't a betrayal of her principles. It was pragmatism. It was survival in an industry that rarely gave second chances to people like her. People without trust funds or industry connections or fancy film school degrees. But deep down, in the part of herself that she'd always tried to keep honest, she knew the truth. She was falling for James Sullivan's enthusiasm, his intelligence, and yes, the way he'd looked at her, like she was saying something worth hearing. And she was terrified that the truth would make all of that disappear. The Honda's engine coughed to life, and Margot pointed it north towards Seattle. She had 5 days until Tuesday. 5 days to figure out how to tell James Sullivan that the meeting that might change both their lives had started with a mistake. 5 days to decide if she was brave enough to risk everything on the truth. The contract arrived on Thursday morning, delivered to Margot's cramped studio apartment in Seattle's Fremont neighborhood by a courier, who made her sign 3 different forms. The document was thick, professional, and terrifyingly real. Margot spread it across her thrift store coffee table, her cat Winston investigating the papers with suspicious sniffs. "What do you think, Win?" she asked, scratching behind his ears. "Am I the worst person in the world?" Winston meowed and knocked a pen off the table, which Margot chose to interpret as feline moral ambiguity rather than judgment. She'd spent the past 3 days in a state of low-grade panic, alternating between rehearsing her confession and convincing herself that maybe, just maybe, she could make this work without ever addressing the misunderstanding. After all, James wanted to fund a coral reef documentary. She wanted to make a coral reef documentary. The method of their meeting was just an inconvenient detail, right? Her phone rang and James's name appeared on the screen. Margot's heart performed an acrobatic routine. "Hello?" "Margot, hi. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." His voice was warm, energetic. "I wanted to touch base before our Tuesday meeting. I've been thinking about the project nonstop." "That's great," Margot said, trying to match his enthusiasm while her guilt gnawed at her. "I'm really excited too. I had an idea I wanted to run by you. What if I came along for some of the filming? Not to interfere with your creative process, but I'd love to see the work firsthand. Understand the subject matter better. Plus, I'll admit I'm selfishly curious about the whole documentary-making process." Margot's first instinct was to say no. Having James around would make everything more complicated, especially when she finally worked up the courage to tell him the truth. But she heard herself saying, "That could actually be interesting. Having someone experience the locations for the first time might give us a fresh perspective." "Fantastic. Where are we filming first?" "The initial shoot is in Monterey at the Bay Aquarium. They have a coral restoration lab I want to feature. After that, we're heading to Hawaii, then possibly the Florida Keys, depending on budget." "I love Monterey," James said. "When do we start?" They discussed logistics for another 20 minutes. And despite her anxiety, Margot found herself enjoying the conversation. James asked thoughtful questions and offered suggestions that actually made sense. He wasn't trying to take over her project. He genuinely wanted to understand it. "I'll see you Tuesday," he said before hanging up. "And Margot? I'm really glad Derek pushed me to take that meeting. This feels like exactly what I needed." After he hung up, Margot sat staring at her phone. Derek had pushed him to take the meeting, which meant James probably took meetings all the time that his partner suggested, which meant he likely hadn't questioned why she was there because he trusted Derek's judgment, which made the whole situation so much worse. Caroline arrived an hour later with Thai food and moral support. She took one look at Margot's face and set down the takeout bags with exaggerated care. "You didn't tell him?" "Margot, I know. But Caroline, he wants to come on the shoot. He's excited about the project. What if I tell him and he pulls everything?" Caroline opened a container of pad thai and pointed her fork at Margot. "What if you don't tell him and he finds out later? That's going to be so much worse. Right now it's an honest mistake. The longer you wait, the more it looks like intentional deception." "It is intentional deception at this point," Margot admitted miserably. "I've had multiple chances to come clean, then use the Tuesday meeting. Sit him down, face to face, and explain everything. He seems like a reasonable guy. And honestly, the fact that he wants to be involved is a good sign. He's invested in more than just the money." Margot picked at her spring roll. "What if I'm not just worried about the funding? What if I'm worried about something else?" Caroline's eyes narrowed. "Oh no. Please tell me you're not developing feelings for venture capital guy? His name's James, and I'm not developing anything. I'm just saying he's interesting and intelligent, and he has this way of listening. That makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. You're describing a crush. I'm describing a professional. Appreciation for a business partner. You lied to, who I accidentally misled. Margot Hayes. I have known you since freshman year of college, when you made a documentary about the cafeteria's food waste that got the dining services director fired. You are many things, but a liar is not one of them. This is eating you alive, and you need to fix it before it destroys something that could actually be good." Deep down, Margot knew Caroline was right, but the thought of seeing disappointment replace The enthusiasm in James's eyes made her stomach hurt. Tuesday arrived with typical Seattle rain, gray and persistent. Margot drove to the airport in her weather-beaten Honda, mentally rehearsing her confession for the 100th time. She'd tell James the truth as soon as they sat down, before any more business was discussed, before anything else could complicate the situation. The flight to San Francisco was turbulent, which Margot took as a metaphor for her life. By the time she arrived at the restaurant James had suggested for their meeting, a farm-toteable place in the Mission District. Her resolve was solid. She found him at a corner table, looking relaxed in jeans and a navy blue Henley. He stood when he saw her, and that smile appeared again, the one that made her forget her carefully planned speeches. Margot. It's good to see you. He gestured to the chair across from him. I took the liberty of ordering the appetizer sampler. Hope that's okay. That's perfect, she said, settling into her seat. Listen, James, before we get into project details, there's something I need to tell you about our first meeting. His phone buzzed loudly on the table. He glanced at it and grimaced. I'm so sorry. Do you mind if I take this? It's Derek, and he's been trying to reach me all morning about a time-sensitive deal, of course. James stepped away from the table, and Margot watched him pace near the restaurant's entrance, his expression growing more animated. He was on the phone for 10 minutes, and when he returned, he looked energized. Sorry about that. We just closed on a renewable energy startup. Very exciting. But you were saying something about our first meeting? The waiter appeared with their appetizers, launching into an elaborate description of each dish. By the time he finished, the moment had passed, and James was already pulling out his tablet to show Margot some research he'd done on coral restoration techniques. I've been reading about this scientist in Australia, Dr. Fiona Wright. Have you considered interviewing her? Her work with heteroresistant coral strains is groundbreaking. Ouch. Margot had considered Dr. Wright and had actually reached out to her months ago without success. She said as much, and James nodded thoughtfully. What if I made an introduction? Sullivan Ventures funded one of her early research grants. She might be more receptive to an interview if it came through me. That would be incredible, Margot admitted, her confession retreating further into the background. They spent the next 2 hours discussing the documentary in detail. James had clearly done his homework, and his suggestions were genuinely helpful. He understood story structure, character development, and the balance between education and entertainment. More than that, he understood why the project mattered. The thing that struck me about your pitch, he said over coffee, was that you weren't just talking about coral. You were talking about hope, about human beings' capacity to fix what we've broken. That's a story people need right now. That's exactly what I'm trying to capture. So many environmental documentaries are just tragedy porn. I want to show that change is possible. You will. I believe that completely. The way he looked at her when he said it made Margot's resolve crumble entirely. She'd tell him after Monterey, after he'd seen her work ethic and her dedication, after he'd had a chance to see that she was serious about the project, after he maybe started to care. About more than just the investment, the Monterey shoot was scheduled for the following week. Margot drove down early with Caroline, who was serving as both producer and cinematographer for the initial filming. They checked into a modest hotel near the waterfront and spent the evening reviewing their equipment and shot lists. Are you going to tell him? Caroline asked for the 5th time. Yes, soon. I just need the right moment. The right moment was 2 weeks ago. Now you're just procrastinating. James arrived the next morning, pulling up in a sleek electric car that probably cost more than Margot's entire film school education. He dressed casually in khakis and a pullover, and he carried a backpack that Margot noted with amusement was stuffed with notepads and what looked like 3 different books about marine biology. I did some homework, he said sheepishly when he caught her looking. Didn't want to ask stupid questions. There are no stupid questions, Margot assured him. Though she found his preparation endearing, the aquarium's coral restoration lab was tucked away behind the public exhibits. A bright space full of tanks, grow lights, and the quiet hum of filtration systems. Dr. Patricia Olson, the marine biologist Margot was interviewing, greeted them with enthusiasm. You must be the documentary team, she said, shaking hands all around. When she got to James, she paused. James Sullivan. I heard you speak at a conservation conference last year. Your thoughts on funding science communication were spot on.
Oh.
James looked pleased. You're too kind. Though I have to give credit to people like Margot here for actually doing the communication work. I just write checks. It's very large checks, from what I understand, Dr. Olson said with a knowing smile. We're grateful for people who put their money where their values are. As they began filming, Margot watched James watching the coral. He asked Dr. Olson thoughtful questions between takes, genuinely curious about the restoration process. He helped Caroline move equipment without being asked. He stayed quiet during filming, taking notes and sketching diagrams that Margot glimpsed were surprisingly detailed. During a break, while Dr. Olson prepared the next demonstration, James joined Margot by one of the larger tanks. This is amazing, he said, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the water. I mean, I've been to aquariums before, but seeing the actual science behind it, understanding what these people are fighting for, it changes the whole context. That's what I want the documentary to do. Change the context. Make people see these ecosystems as worth saving. He turned to her, his expression serious. You're going to do that. I have no doubt. They were standing close. Close enough that Margot could see the flecks of green in his hazel eyes. Close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. For a moment, the guilt receded, replaced by something more immediate and electric. Caroline cleared her throat loudly from across the room. We're ready for the next segment. The rest of the day passed in a blur of filming, interviews, and B-roll footage. By the time they wrapped, the sun was setting over Monterey Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Dinner? James suggested. I know a place with incredible seafood. My treat, obviously, since you've been working all day. They found a restaurant on the wharf, a casual spot with outdoor seating and views of the harbor. Caroline excused herself after the appetizers, claiming exhaustion, though Margot caught the pointed look her friend gave her before leaving, alone with James. Margot felt the weight of her secret pressing down harder. She should tell him now. The setting was perfect, intimate without being romantic, public enough that neither of them would make a scene. I wanted to thank you, James said before she could start her confession, for letting me tag along today. I've been stuck in boardrooms and pitch meetings for months. Being in that lab, seeing the actual impact of the work we fund, it reminded me why I do this. Why do you do it? Margot asked, genuinely curious. You could invest in anything. Tech startups, real estate, whatever makes the most money. Why environmental projects? James was quiet for a moment, watching the boats bob in the harbor. My mom was a biologist. She studied wetland ecosystems and spent most of my childhood dragging me through marshes and swamps. I hated it as a kid, all the mud and bugs. But she'd get this look on her face when she was working, this pure joy at understanding how everything connected. She died when I was in college. Pancreatic cancer, very fast. I'm sorry, Margot said softly. Thanks. The thing is, after she died, I inherited some money and used it to start Sullivan Ventures. Derek wanted to focus on high-growth tech, and we do that. But I insisted we reserve part of our fund for environmental and conservation projects. It was my way of keeping her with me, I guess. Funding the kind of work she would have loved. Margot felt something crack inside her chest. Here was James, sharing something deeply personal, trusting her with his grief and his motivations. And she was still lying to him. It's beautiful, she managed. She'd be proud of what you're doing. I hope so, though I think she'd have gotten a kick out of this particular project. She loved coral reefs. We went snorkeling in Belize when I was 12, and she spent hours just floating there, pointing out different species. I was bored out of my mind at the time, but looking back, I can see how much it meant to her. He smiled, but there was sadness in it. Margot wanted to reach across the table and take his hand. She wanted to tell him that his mother would absolutely be proud. She wanted to tell him the truth. Instead, she said, I'm glad I can help continue that work in some small way. They talked for another hour. The conversation flowing easily from documentary filmmaking to James's work to their favorite places to travel. Margot learned that he played guitar badly, that he'd once tried to climb Kilimanjaro and failed spectacularly, and that he had a secret passion for terrible reality TV shows. "Don't judge me," he said, laughing. "But there's something soothing about watching people dramatically compete over baking cakes or designing clothes. It's like mental junk food. I'm not judging. I once spent an entire weekend watching a show about people who buy storage units, see? We're both trash." The easy banter felt natural, comfortable in a way that made Margot forget, momentarily, about the lie hanging between them. But when James insisted on walking her back to her hotel, the guilt returned with force. "I managed to save most of it," Caroline said, her hair wild from running her hands through it. "But the interview with Dr. Kapoor is definitely gone. And about half the underwater footage." James rolled up his sleeves. "Okay, what can we do? Can we recreate any of it? I still have contacts in Hawaii. Maybe we can arrange another shoot." They worked through the night, assessing the damage, making lists of what could be salvaged and what needed to be reshot. James ordered food, made calls despite the late hour, and generally made himself indispensable. By dawn, they had a plan. It would require another trip to Hawaii, more money, and extended timelines. But the documentary could be saved. Margot finally collapsed on her couch around 6 a.m, exhausted and grateful. James sat next to her, equally tired, his expensive suit rumpled, and his hair sticking up at odd angles. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this. You didn't have to stay." "Of course I did. We're partners." He paused, then added, "and friends, I hope." "Definitely friends." Something passed between them, something Margot had been trying to ignore for weeks. James reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering for just a moment too long. "Margot, I need to tell you something. This project, working with you, it's become more than just business for me. You've reminded me why I do this work, why it matters. And somewhere along the way, I started to care about you as more than just a filmmaker I'm funding." This was the moment she'd been both hoping for and dreading. She wanted to lean into his touch, to close the distance between them, to let herself feel everything she'd been suppressing, but she couldn't, not like this. "James, wait. There's something I have to tell you. Something I should have told you from the beginning." His hand dropped and concern flickered across his face. "What is it?" Before Margot could answer, the apartment door opened and Derek walked in, followed by Caroline, who looked confused and apologetic.
"Oh, Caroline."
"Sorry," Caroline mouthed to Margot. "I've been calling you for hours," Derek said, barely acknowledging the others. "We need to talk about the Patterson deal. They're pulling out, unless we can guarantee he stopped," finally taking in the scene. "Am I interrupting something?" "It can wait," James said firmly. "It really can't. This is a $20 million deal." James looked torn, his eyes moving between Derek and Margot. "Can you give me 5 minutes?" "I've been giving you 5 minutes for 3 weeks, Derek said with uncharacteristic frustration. "Ever since you got involved with this documentary, you've been checked out of everything else. The partners are starting to notice. Derek, not now.
I'll win."
Then. You've poured time and resources into this project, and I get that it's important to you, but Sullivan Ventures has other obligations." Derek pulled out his tablet. "Do you even remember agreeing to this pitch meeting? The one 3 weeks ago that I set up? You walked in late, took one meeting I didn't schedule, and then disappeared into this coral reef obsession." The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. "What are you talking about?" James asked slowly. "You told me about Margot's documentary. You said I should meet with her." Derek looked genuinely confused. "I told you about the Patterson portfolio company pitch. That's who was supposed to be in the conference room that morning. Software, enterprise, solutions, not documentaries." The color drained from James's face. "Then who?" He turned to Margot, and she watched understanding dawn in his eyes. "You weren't supposed to be in that meeting." It wasn't a question. Margot felt everything crumbling. "I can explain." "You weren't supposed to be there," James repeated, his voice hollow. "You went to the wrong meeting. And you let me believe you were supposed to pitch to us. You let me offer you funding for a project I never intended to invest in. It wasn't like that. Not exactly. I mean, yes, I went to the wrong floor, but once I realized what happened, I tried to tell you. Multiple times. Something always interrupted, or I thought, you thought what? That you'd just go along with it? That you'd take $300,000 from me based on a misunderstanding? Derek was looking between them, finally catching on. Oh man, this is bad. James, please, let me explain properly, Margot begged. That first day I genuinely didn't realize the mistake until after I left. And then I panicked. I should have told you immediately. I know that. But you were so excited about the project. I'd been struggling for years to get funding. I just thought you'd lie to me, James finished, his voice cold. For weeks. Through all those conversations, all those long nights working together, you were lying. I wasn't lying. The project is real. My passion for it is real. Everything I told you about the documentary, about why it matters, that was all true. But we never would have met if you hadn't walked into the wrong room. And you didn't correct that mistake. You let me build expectations, make plans, invest time and money, and he stopped, running his hand through his hair. God, I told you about my mother, about why I fund these projects. And the whole time you knew you were there by accident? The hurt in his voice was worse than anger would have been. Your mother is exactly why I didn't tell you, Margot said desperately. Because you care so much about this work. Because the documentary is important and necessary. Because I knew if I told you the truth, I'd lose the opportunity to make something that could actually matter. So you chose the documentary over honesty. Over me, that's not fair. It's not fair, James said. His voice rising is letting someone care about you. Letting them open up to you while you're keeping a secret that invalidates the entire foundation of our relationship. We have a relationship beyond that first meeting. The work we've done together, the friendship we've built, that's all real. Is it? Or was I just the wallet? The means to an end? James grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair. You know what the worst part is? If you had told me the truth that first day, I probably would have laughed it off. Maybe even funded the project anyway because your pitch was that good. But you didn't trust me enough to be honest. You didn't trust that I could see past the mistake to the value of what you were proposing. James, please don't go. We can work through this. He paused at the door, and for a moment, Margot thought he might stay. But when he looked back at her, his eyes were distant, the warmth she'd grown used to completely gone. I need time to think. About the project, about everything. Derek, let's go. Derek cast an apologetic glance at Margot before following James out. The door closed with a quiet click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Caroline immediately wrapped Margot in a hug. I'm so sorry. I tried to stop Derek, but he just barged in. Margot pulled away, numb. It's not your fault. It was always going to come out eventually. I just hoped I'd be the one to tell him. She walked to the window, watching the Seattle morning come to life. Somewhere out there, James was angry and hurt, and probably rethinking every interaction they'd had. The documentary was in jeopardy. The partnership was destroyed. And the friendship, the connection that had started to mean more to her than she'd admitted, was likely gone forever. What do I do? She asked Carolyn. You fight for it?
For him.
You show him that the mistake doesn't define you. But Margot wasn't sure anymore. Maybe the mistake did define her. Maybe she was exactly what James now thought she was. Someone willing to sacrifice integrity for opportunity. Her phone buzzed with an email. James's assistant, formal and brief, informing her that Sullivan Ventures was placing the documentary funding on hold, pending further review. All scheduled shoots were canceled. They would be in touch regarding next steps. Margot forwarded the email to Caroline without comment, then walked into her bedroom and shut the door. Winston jumped onto the bed, purring and kneading her stomach. She buried her face in his fur and let herself cry. Outside, Seattle went about its business, indifferent to her heartbreak. The rain started again, steady and relentless, matching her tears. She'd lost it all. The documentary. The funding. And worst of all, James's respect and trust. All because she'd been too scared to tell the truth when it mattered. The next week passed in a blur of misery. Margot couldn't work on the documentary without thinking about James. Every piece of footage they'd captured together, every decision they'd made, was tainted now. Caroline tried to stay optimistic, reaching out to other potential funders. But without James's connections and resources, the project was essentially dead. Margot's phone stayed silent. No calls from James, no emails, nothing. She drafted 100 messages to him and deleted them all. What could she say that would make a difference? She'd betrayed his trust. Apologies felt hollow. On the 8th day, Caroline burst into the apartment, waving her laptop. Margot, you need to see this. If it's another rejection from a funder, I don't want to know. It's not that. It's about James. Margot sat up reluctantly. Caroline turned the laptop to show her a blog post from a major environmental journalism site. The headline read, Sullivan Ventures Executive Steps. Down from Ocean Conservation. Board before ever serving. The article explained that James Sullivan had declined the board position with the National Ocean Conservation Alliance, citing personal reasons. But it included a quote from James that made Margot's chest ache. I've recently learned some important lessons about the difference between good intentions and genuine integrity. I need to take time to ensure my own actions align with my stated values before I can effectively serve in a leadership role for such an important organization. He's punishing himself, Caroline said quietly. He thinks he should have caught the deception. That he's complicit somehow because he didn't ask the right questions. Margot felt sick. This is all my fault. Yes, it is. But you can fix it. Or at least try to. How? He won't even talk to me. Then make him listen. Margot spent the next 2 days crafting a letter. Not an email, but an actual physical letter written by hand on nice paper. She told James everything. About her struggles to get funding. About the panic she felt when she realized the mistake. About every single time she'd almost told him and why she hadn't. She acknowledged the hurt she'd caused and took full responsibility. But she also told him the truth about everything else. About how working with him had reminded her why she became a filmmaker in the first place. About how his enthusiasm and curiosity had made her a better storyteller. About how she'd started to fall for him somewhere between Monterey and Maui. How that had made the lying even worse because she knew she was risking something real. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for the funding to be reinstated. She just asked for one conversation, face to face, where she could apologize properly and say goodbye to what might have been. She mailed the letter to Sullivan Ventures office and tried not to hope for a response. 3 days later, Caroline shook her awake at dawn. James is here. Margot stumbled out of bed, her heart racing. Through the window, she could see James's car parked on the street. She threw on decent clothes and tried to do something with her hair before giving up and going outside. James was leaning against his car, looking tired and thinner than she remembered. He straightened when he saw her. Hi, she said lamely. Hi. They stood in awkward silence for a moment before James pulled her letter from his jacket pocket. I've read this about 50 times, he said. I've been angry at you for lying. Angry at myself for not catching it. Angry at the whole situation. Paused. But mostly, I've been sad. Because I miss you. I miss working with you. I miss talking to you. And I keep trying to figure out if what we had was real or if it was all based on this lie. It was real, Margot said firmly. The mistake at the beginning was accident, and then cowardice, and then fear. But everything else was real. My passion for the documentary, my respect for you. She stopped, not sure if she should finish. Your what? My feelings for you, she admitted. Which I know doesn't matter now and probably makes everything worse. But it's the truth. And I'm done lying, even by omission. James looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, I talked to Derek. Multiple times. He thinks I'm being too harsh. That the mistake was understandable, and I should focus on the quality of the work rather than the circumstances of how we met. Derek's very generous. Also pointed out that I've been miserable without you. That I've been snapping at everyone at the office and generally being impossible to work with. James smiled slightly. He threatened to fire me from my own company if I didn't at least talk to you. Hope flickered in Margot's chest. So you're here to talk? I'm here because I've been doing a lot of thinking. About my mother, actually. About what she would say about this situation. He pushed off from the car, taking a step closer to Margot. My mom was big on second chances. She used to say that mistakes are only failures if you don't learn from them. That the measure of a person isn't whether they mess up, but what they do afterward. I messed up, Margot said, her voice breaking. I messed up badly, and I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. I know you are. I can see it in your letter, in your face right now. And the thing is, I believe you. I believe that you were scared and made a bad decision. I believe that you tried to tell me and kept getting interrupted by life. I even believe that you have real feelings for me, though I'm still processing how I feel about that. I understand if you can't forgive me. That's the thing, James said, closing the distance between them. I do forgive you. Maybe not completely yet. Maybe I need more time for that. But I forgive you enough to want to try again. To see if we can build something honest, starting now. Margot's eyes filled with tears. You want to continue the documentary? I want to continue everything. The documentary, the partnership, the friendship. Maybe even whatever this other thing is between us. If you're willing to take it slow and let me rebuild trust, yes, God. Yes, anything. James reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. But no more secrets. No more lies, not even small ones. If we're doing this, we're doing it with complete honesty. Complete honesty, Margot agreed. Starting now. So I should tell you that your hair is sticking up in the back and you have coffee stains on your shirt. He laughed, and the sound was like sunlight breaking through clouds. And I should tell you that you have major bedhead and you're wearing mismatched socks. They're a fashion statement.
Sure they are.
They smiled at each other, the tension finally breaking. It wasn't perfect. The hurt was still there. The breach of trust still needed mending. But it was a start. So what happens now? Margot asked. Now we get Caroline and go get breakfast. Then we figure out how to save the documentary. And then maybe, if you're interested, we could try an actual date. One where we both know exactly why we're there and what we're doing. I'd like that. James took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. For what it's worth, I'm glad you walked into the wrong meeting that day. Even with all the complications, I wouldn't trade it. Sometimes the best things in life come from accidents. That's a very romantic way of saying I'm a disaster, Margot teased. You're my disaster, James said, and then, perhaps realizing what he'd said, blushed. Potentially. If we can make this work, we'll make it work, Margot said with more confidence than she felt. But looking at James, at the cautious hope in his eyes that mirrored her own, she thought maybe they actually could. The documentary took another 4 months to complete. They did return to Hawaii, reshot the lost footage, and added even more depth to the story. James was involved in every step, but their working relationship was different, now more balanced, more honest. With boundaries clearly drawn and respected, they went on that first official date, and then a second, and a third. They took it slow, rebuilding trust, one conversation at a time. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when Margot could see James hesitate, see him wondering if she was being fully truthful. There were times when her own guilt made her over-explain things that didn't need explanation. But gradually, the trust returned, stronger for having been tested and rebuilt. The documentary premiered at Sundance 9 months after that. It's a disastrous meeting where the truth came out. It received a standing ovation and sold to a major streaming platform for distribution. Reviews called it a masterpiece of environmental storytelling and a testament to the power of hope. At the after-party, James found Margot on the balcony, looking out at the snow-covered mountains. Congratulations, he said, handing her a glass of champagne. You did it. You made something that matters. We did it, she corrected. I couldn't have done this without you. And I don't just mean the money, I know. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. So, what's next? More documentaries? That series we talked about? Definitely. But first I think I need a vacation. Somewhere with a beach? Somewhere we can just relax and not think about coral reefs or production schedules or anything work-related. I know just the place, James said. There's this little island off Belize. My mom took me there once. It's quiet, beautiful, perfect for forgetting the rest of the world exists. That sounds perfect. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the party continue inside. Caroline caught Margot's eye through the window and gave her an enthusiastic thumbs up. Derek was deep in conversation with several streaming executives, probably already lining up funding for future projects. Can I tell you something? James asked. Always. I'm glad you walked into the wrong meeting that day, Margot laughed. You've said that before, I know. But I mean it even more now. Yes, the beginning was messy and built on a misunderstanding. Yes, we had to work through some serious trust issues. But Margot, I love you. I love your passion and your talent and even your tendency to overcomplicate things. I love who I am when I'm with you, and I wouldn't have any of that if you hadn't accidentally walked into my conference room. Margot's heart swelled. I love you too, and I promise from here on out, I'm walking into exactly the rooms I mean to. Except when you're not, James teased. Because I have a feeling your best adventures will always involve a little bit of chaos. You're probably right. He kissed her then, soft and sweet. With all of Park City twinkling below them and their future stretching out bright and full of possibility, it had started with a mistake.
Yes.
But mistakes, Margot had learned, weren't endings. They were beginnings in disguise, opportunities dressed up as disasters. The key was what you did with them afterward,